I've always seen public meltdowns as over-the-top drama, until I found cases where things went too far. Hi, I'm Tucker, and today, I'm uncovering the worst Karen deaths ever recorded. From a Karen's dispute over a neighbor's tree that ended up falling on her, to another who kicked a cake during an event and got her karma she couldn't recover from. It was September 3rd, 2017, on a quiet residential street in Decatur, Georgia. The morning was calm. The houses sat close together the way they do in older developments, with trees along the property lines that had been growing for decades before anyone thought to argue about them. Mary Ann Keller was 52 years old and worked as a paralegal. She owned the house on the left side of one of those boundaries. For more than 3 years, she had been keeping a record on the oak tree that sat just over her neighbor's side of the line. She had photographs of the roots. She had notes about the limbs that extended over her yard. She had filed complaints and followed up on them. In her view, the tree was a threat, and nobody was moving fast enough to deal with it. 3 years of documentation, photographs, filed complaints, follow-up calls. I will give her this much. She was organized, but what baffles me is the chain of events that played out next. Things came to a head when she went to confront her neighbor directly. She demanded the tree be cut down, telling her neighbor it was damaging her property and that she had been patient long enough. When the conversation stalled, she did not leave. She repeated the demand, raised her voice, and stepped closer as her neighbor attempted to disengage. The exchange turned physical. Her neighbor slapped her. Mary Ann went home and decided she was done waiting for anyone else to act. She hired an arborist on her own. She did not coordinate with her neighbor. The scope of the work was specific. Remove only the limbs extending over her property line, presenting the job as work confined strictly within her side of the boundary, to reduce what she saw as the structural risk. The arborist was operating as a small, independent contractor, and the job was treated as a limited trim rather than a full structural assessment. He agreed to proceed on those terms, with no full assessment and no formal plan for where cut material would fall. She hired someone to cut a tree she did not own, without a structural assessment, without a fall zone plan. I kept trying to understand what was actually going on in her mind. The tree itself was mature. It had a slight lean toward Mary Ann's property. The soil around its base was compacted, the kind of ground that does not hold roots as firmly as it looks like it should. Some of the roots along the property line had already been disturbed over the years. The tree had stayed upright because the weight on both sides of the canopy balanced each other out. The arborist had told her to keep clear of the base while he worked, but she remained within a few feet of the trunk, inside the radius of the canopy, focused on the cuts being made above her. Her attention stayed on the canopy rather than the base of the tree. The arborist began cutting from one side. The first limbs came down without any visible problem. Then he removed a section that had been counterweighting the heavier side of the canopy, reducing the torque on the trunk. As the final fibers of the cut section gave way, the limb dropped free. Then the load shifted abruptly through the trunk toward the lean. The arborist paused to reposition his equipment. The stress moved down into the root plate. There was a low cracking sound at the base. The soil near the roots shifted slightly. The shift was gradual for a few seconds. A lift at the root plate, a widening gap in the soil, and then the movement accelerated. Once the trunk committed to the lean, the fall completed in seconds. Mary Ann was still looking at the canopy when the trunk came down across her. The weight of it compressed her chest and torso against the ground. She did not move after the impact. Emergency services were called. Neighbors appeared at the doors. Mary Ann Keller was pronounced dead following emergency assessment at the scene. A review of the incident found that the removal of a key counterbalancing limb had altered the tree's structural stability. The root system had been vulnerable before the work began. No full stability assessment had been carried out before cutting started. No fall zone had been established. Mary Ann had been standing within the impact zone during active cutting. The incident was classified as a fatal tree failure resulting from structural imbalance introduced during partial limb removal, conducted without full stability assessment or safe positioning of persons on site. You know what really gets me about this? The neighbor she had been fighting with for 3 years was inside her house when it happened. Mary Ann's case started with a boundary dispute and ended with her standing in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong moment. The next case I looked into also started with a boundary, a safety barrier at a river's edge in Florida, and someone who decided it did not apply to her. It was August 9th, 2021, at a riverside viewpoint along a slow-moving waterway outside Gainesville, Florida. The midday heat was sitting heavy over the bank, and the water below was dark and slightly opaque, the kind of tannin-stained surface that limits visibility below even a few inches down. Aisha Bello was 31 years old and had come to the viewpoint with a group of friends. She worked as a graphic designer and had a habit of framing everything through a camera lens, always looking for the best angle, always adjusting her position to get the shot she wanted. That afternoon, she was focused on photographing the river from the viewing platform. The platform had a fixed metal safety barrier running along the edge of a sloped bank that dropped sharply toward the waterline. The top rail sat around waist height. Signs posted along the barrier stated clearly that leaning over or crossing it was not permitted. The bank below was eroded and angled, meaning anyone who went past the railing had no stable ground beneath them. The rest of the group stayed back. Florida, alligator season, a safety barrier with signs on it, and she called it excessive. I genuinely do not know what was going through her mind. Aisha moved closer to the barrier and looked over the top rail at the water below. When one of her friends hesitated and pointed to the warning signs, she waved it off, saying the rules were excessive and didn't apply to something this simple. She leaned forward over the top rail to get the shot she wanted, glancing back briefly as if expecting someone to object, then continuing when no one stopped her. She extended her arm down past the barrier toward the surface, lowering her hand toward the water. She told her friends there was nothing there, insisting the warnings were overblown and that people always made things sound more dangerous than they actually were. It was literally just water. Her torso was angled forward well over the top rail, her upper body extended past it with her center of gravity already shifted beyond her base of support. When one of her friends said her name, she told them to relax and stop overreacting, adding that she knew what she was doing and wasn't going anywhere. I have read a lot of these cases, which you can check out later, but this is the first time I have seen someone argue with their friends about safety while danger was a second away. The water below the bank looked still. It was not empty. A large alligator had been resting at the waterline, partially submerged and motionless close to the bank's edge. When her hand dropped low enough into its range, the animal reacted with a short, explosive lateral surge from the edge. The contact with her extended arm applied sudden lateral force. At the exact moment, her center of gravity was already past the railing. With her weight forward and no stable footing on the sloped ground behind her, the force on her arm removed the last point of balance. She went forward over the top rail and down the eroded bank toward the water line in an uncontrolled fall. She reached the water's edge at the bottom of the bank. The alligator was already there. It clamped down on her arm and pulled her into the shallow edge water. The animal rolled, pulling her under and away from the bank. Her friends could see the surface of the water moving from above, but could not reach her. The movement stopped after a short time, and the surface settled. Aisha did not come back up. Her friends reacted immediately. Someone called 911 within seconds. Others moved toward the barrier. Emergency services were dispatched and arrived shortly after. Wildlife authorities were also contacted. Efforts were made to reach Aisha at the base of the bank, but the conditions at the waterline and the presence of the animal in the immediate area complicated the initial response. Aisha Bello was pronounced dead following emergency response efforts at the scene. The cause of death was recorded as fatal injuries sustained during an uncontrolled fall and wildlife encounter at the river's edge. Investigators confirmed that the safety barrier had been functioning as intended and was sufficient when used correctly. Every warning that existed in that moment was present and working. The sign, the barrier, her friends. She walked past all three. I do not know how many times a situation has to tell you no before it counts, and she paid the price. The next case I want to cover is about someone who also thought she had a better way of doing things than the people around her. Except her version of that involved walking into a professional kitchen during a dinner rush with a thermometer she had not calibrated. It was March 22nd, 2021, inside a mid-range casual restaurant during the early evening dinner rush in Columbus, Ohio. The kitchen was moving at full pace. Tables were filled, orders were going in, and the staff were working through the service the way they always did on a busy Monday night. Lydia Harper was 47 years old and was a compliance auditor. She was dining alone. She had ordered a steak and been specific about it from the start, telling the server exactly how she wanted it cooked and making clear that precision mattered to her. Her colleagues said she once flagged a catering order at a work event for the same reason and made the staff reheat every dish before she would sit down. When the plate arrived, she cut into it, looked at the center, and put her knife down. She reached into her bag and pulled out a digital food thermometer she had brought with her. She inserted it into the steak and read the number. The reading came back lower than she expected. She relied on it as definitive. The steak had been cooked within the safe and standard temperature range. Lydia did not know that. She called the server back, then again. Her voice rose above the ambient noise of the dining room. She told the server the kitchen did not know what they were doing and that the food was unsafe. The server offered to have the steak remade and explained how internal temperatures were measured in the kitchen. Lydia dismissed the explanation rather than engaging with it. She said she had the number right in front of her. She asked for the manager and made clear she intended to report the restaurant. The server stepped away to get the manager. Lydia stood up from her table. She followed the server toward the back of the restaurant. When the server passed through the kitchen door, Lydia pushed through it behind her, moving past the point where customers were expected to stop. "I have never worked in a professional kitchen, but I know enough to understand that walking into one during a dinner rush uninvited is not something you do." Lydia knew enough about compliance to carry a thermometer in her bag. Somehow that did not make the list. The kitchen was in full service. Staff were moving between stations. Plates were going out. A section of the floor near the prep area had been mopped during service to clear a spill. A warning sign was present, though it sat slightly off the path she had taken coming through the door. Near the prep line, a low-profile grease trap cover sat flush with the floor, with a rigid metal edge slightly raised above the surrounding surface. The lip was rigid and fixed with no give on contact. Lydia, still focused on catching the server, was not watching where she was going. Her foot hit the mopped surface. The wet floor offered no traction under her forward step. Her foot lost traction on the wet surface, and her forward momentum carried her past the point where she could recover. The back of her head struck first against the raised metal edge of the grease trap cover. She did not respond or move after the impact. Kitchen staff responded immediately. Emergency services were called. The dinner service stopped. Paramedics arrived and assessed her on site. Lydia Harper was pronounced dead at the scene. And here is one part that really stands out to me. A review of the incident determined that the steak had been cooked within the accepted safe temperature range and that her thermometer reading had been inaccurate due to shallow insertion and improper calibration. She had entered a restricted work area without authorization. The steak was fine. The kitchen was doing its job. I keep thinking about how differently that evening goes if she had just considered for one moment that the thermometer might be wrong. Lydia walked into a kitchen that didn't need her and paid for it. But the next case is worse. Another woman who couldn't stay out of where she didn't belong. It started in a pharmacy queue and ended badly. It was June 14th, 2019, at a retail pharmacy in Scottsdale, Arizona. The afternoon queue was backed up past the greeting card aisle, and the two staff members on duty were working through prescriptions as fast as the verification process allowed. Danielle Brooks was 42 years old and was a real estate agent who had built her career on moving fast and making decisions without much patience for process. Earlier that week, she had taken amoxicillin for a minor infection and developed a rash and throat irritation within hours. She went to a clinic for evaluation, and the physician identified a suspected penicillin allergy based on her symptoms and advised strict avoidance of all penicillin-based medications going forward. Danielle questioned whether the doctor was being overly cautious and suggested the reaction had been exaggerated. She had not filled any follow-up prescriptions or obtained emergency medication after the clinic visit. I want to be fair. She was unwell. She was uncomfortable. But the decisions she made from that clinic visit forward removed every safety net she had. At home, her husband urged her to go to a pharmacy and get the correct prescription filled properly, but she refused. Over the next 2 days, her symptoms worsened enough that she finally drove to the pharmacy. She was not in a patient mood when she arrived. While waiting in line, she checked her watch more than once and let out quiet but noticeable sighs as the queue moved slower than she expected. By the time she reached the counter, her frustration had settled into something more pointed. She told the pharmacist she had been standing there there far too long and wanted to know what exactly was causing the delay. As he began to explain the workload and the verification procedures required for each prescription, she cut him off before he could finish. When he tried again to clarify, she spoke over him a second time. She leaned slightly on the counter, her voice raised just enough for the people behind her to hear. She asked to see his credentials. When he remained calm and continued working through the queue in order, she interpreted the lack of reaction as indifference rather than professionalism. The pharmacist she was speaking over was, at that exact moment, the most important person in that building for her. He was the one who caught what happened next. During the exchange, he was in the middle of assisting another customer at the adjacent register. A completed prescription, already verified and bagged for that customer, had been set on the counter within the pickup area. As part of that transaction, while he confirmed a detail on the system, Danielle saw the bag and immediately assumed it was hers. The label was turned away from her, and although her name was not visible, the timing aligned with her expectation that her prescription should already have been ready. Acting on that assumption, she took the bag and stepped away from the counter, opening it as she walked. Without properly checking the label, she removed 2 of the pills and swallowed them with a sip from her water bottle, treating the moment as the conclusion of a delay she believed had already been resolved. And this is where everything took an unexpected turn. The pharmacist turned back just in time to see her with the open bag. He immediately told her the medication was not hers and that it contained a penicillin-based compound. He moved to clear space around her and instructed a colleague to call emergency services. Danielle initially dismissed the warning, stating that she felt fine and that the concern was excessive. As emergency services were being contacted, the pharmacist stayed with her, keeping her engaged and observing for changes. The first visible signs began to appear. She paused mid-sentence and touched her throat. Flushing spread across her face and neck. Her breathing became labored and uneven, noticeable from across the counter. As the symptoms progressed, her posture changed. She stopped arguing and lowered herself into a seated position without prompting. The pharmacist stayed beside her, continuing to monitor her condition and relay updates to the dispatcher while waiting for paramedics. By the time paramedics arrived, the reaction had advanced to a severe stage of anaphylaxis. Emergency treatment was initiated immediately, and she was transported to the hospital. Despite rapid intervention, the reaction continued to progress, and her condition deteriorated further after arrival due to the severity of the exposure. Danielle Brooks died later that evening. The cause of death was recorded as acute anaphylaxis, triggered by penicillin exposure, following ingestion of medication not prescribed to her. The pharmacist tried to stop her. I am not sure what it would have taken to get through to her at that point, but whatever it was, nobody in that building had it. So far, every case has been about someone ignoring rules and warnings. This one's no different, except it began at a birthday party and ended in a way no one in that room saw coming. It was July 17, 2015, at a small event hall in Charlotte, North Carolina. The room had been set up for a birthday celebration that was also carrying a second announcement, an engagement. The tables were decorated, the lights were low, and most of the guests were in a good mood when the night began. Vanessa Grant was 36 years old and was a guest. She had known the celebrant for years, close enough that she expected to be treated as someone who mattered in that room. When she arrived and found her seat, it was not at the main table. Others were being called forward, acknowledged in front of the room, included in ways that she was not. She noticed all of it. The engagement announcement had not been shared with her beforehand. She found out the same way the rest of the room did. To most people there, it was a happy moment. To Vanessa, it landed differently. I want to be clear about what she decided in that moment. She took an engagement announcement at someone else's birthday party as a personal attack. In a room celebrating something unrelated to her, she chose to make it about herself. She began making her feelings known. She approached guests near the center of the room and raised the issue of being overlooked, insisting it was deliberate and that she should not have been treated that way after everything she had put into the friendship. Her voice carried. The tone was not quiet. Some guests tried to redirect the conversation. Others stepped back. The attention in the room, which had just been warm and celebratory, began to shift. The cake table was positioned near the center of the hall. It was a folding table, the kind used at events because it is easy to set up and easy to move. The legs locked into place, but were not built to absorb lateral force. A layered cake sat on top, a tablecloth draped all the way to the floor, covering the frame underneath. Let me be real about this. The world doesn't revolve around her, but she just decided it should. Vanessa moved toward it. She placed both hands on the edge of the table and pushed forward and upward to flip it. But the table did not respond the way she expected. The weight of the cake was not centered. One set of folding legs gave way before the other. The table did not flip. It buckled, dropping sharply on one side while the other side lifted. Vanessa's forward momentum had already been committed. She had pushed forward with her full body weight, and the surface in front of her gave way too early to support it. The tablecloth shifted and tightened around her feet as the frame collapsed, catching at her lower legs just as her balance tipped forward. There was nothing stable left in front of her to brace against and no time to pull back. Her balance broke forward. She stumbled into the collapsing table and went down with it, her body continuing past the point where she could recover. As the table frame folded unevenly, one section of the metal support structure dropped, while another remained partially upright at an angle beneath the falling surface. With no opportunity to break her fall, she was carried forward into it. Her upper body struck first. The impact occurred against the exposed metal frame at a downward angle, with the force concentrated across a small, rigid edge at head level. Before her body continued to the floor, she fell into the collapsed table as it came apart beneath her. Emergency services were called. Guests moved back from the table. The room that had been celebrating an engagement minutes earlier went quiet. Vanessa Grant was pronounced dead following emergency assessment at the scene. A review of the incident determined that she had applied deliberate force to an unstable folding table, causing an asymmetric collapse of the support legs. With her movement restricted during the collapse, she was unable to recover and fell into the exposed metal frame, sustaining a fatal blunt force head injury. I still don't understand why the cake table became her enemy, but she turned a night meant for celebration into tragedy. Meanwhile, the last case I want to cover is the one that started the earliest in the morning and ended the fastest. Black Friday, a crowd that had been standing in the cold since the night before, and one person who decided she did not need to. It was November 29th, 2019, at the entrance of a large electronics store in Memphis, Tennessee, in the early hours of Black Friday. The doors were scheduled to open at 5 a.m. Customers had been outside since the night before, standing in a line that grew longer and tighter as the morning crept forward. The crowd was packed tightly, with little space between individuals. The store had advertised limited quantities on high-demand items. Tasha Reynolds was 38 years old and arrived shortly before 4 a.m. She did not join the back of the line. She moved toward the front, stepping past people who had been there for hours. Pushing when stepping was not enough. The people around her noticed. Some said nothing, others spoke up. By the time she was near the front, several confrontations had already started, voices rising over each other in the cold morning air. She raised her voice over all of it, insisting she was not going to stand at the back behind people who did not even know what they were there for. The store doors were still closed. Staff were inside preparing. There was no one outside managing the crowd. I genuinely cannot imagine looking at a line of people who have been standing in the cold since midnight and deciding that your 4 in the morning arrival puts you at the front. That is the entire setup for everything that follows. Tasha kept moving forward. The arguments around her sharpened. People who had given up sleep to be there were not willing to simply step aside. The pushing and the words continued until Tasha reached into her bag and pulled out a small canister of pepper spray. She pointed it forward and released it. The spray hit the people directly in front of her. It then dispersed unevenly through the tightly packed crowd, affecting people beyond those directly in front of her. Some recoiled immediately, turning their faces away and raising their arms. Others pushed blindly in different directions, trying to escape the irritation in their eyes and throat. The movement was no longer linear. It broke into conflicting directions within the same space. In a crowd that close, with almost no room between bodies and nowhere for air to move, there was no clean direction to escape. The structure of the line collapsed in that section as individuals stumbled into each other. I still cannot get over the fact that she packed pepper spray for a shopping queue and then actually used it. An off-duty police officer was standing in the line nearby. He identified himself as law enforcement and gave repeated verbal commands, waiting a moment for compliance. When she did not comply, he moved to restrain her and attempted to pull her away from the crowd while others nearby began calling emergency services. The two of them struggled. Around them, people were shifting and pulling back, which meant the ground underneath them was never still. Both of them lost their footing more than once as the crowd moved. Staff inside, aware of the growing pressure at the entrance, began unlocking the doors. The doors opened partway. The struggle carried forward with the movement of the crowd. into the entrance corridor where a promotional display had been set up just inside. The force of multiple bodies pressing into the display at once shifted the frame off balance, partially dislodging one of the mounted television units from its bracket. As he tried to control her arms, she pulled away sharply, shifting her weight backward into the display frame. The back of her head struck the rigid edge, and she collapsed immediately. As she fell, one of the partially dislodged television units dropped from above and struck her. The people nearby stepped back. Multiple people had already begun calling emergency services. Staff came out from behind the counter. The line, which had been the entire point of the morning, stopped mattering. Responders arrived and began their assessment. Tasha Reynolds was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of death was recorded as fatal blunt force head trauma, with the primary impact against the edge of the display structure and a contributing secondary impact from the falling unit. She pepper sprayed a crowd, fought a police officer, and never even made it through the door. I have to be honest, when I first read this, I had to go back and check what was on sale that morning. Trust me, it wasn't worth it.